Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a beer, it's time for some Path of Exile discussion. So today I want to go through the patch notes for 3.17.0, which are really extensive, and just point out the things that I think are particularly significant. One thing to note is that my earlier video on the balance manifesto, which is quite long, does cover quite a lot of that. Link to that down in the description below, but there'll be a lot of discussion that would have overlapped there. I'm not going to repeat that here. I will just point out a couple of things that I noticed that were particularly interesting. So one of the things with patch notes, they always start with just a little bit of a storyline, exposition of what's happened since the last league. It doesn't really affect gameplay much. It's just pointing out here that after you defeat Kitava in Act 10, you meet Kirak now in the Karui Shores. So the storyline is going to be a little bit different. The flow after completing endgame is going to be a bit different. You're not going to have those Oriath fetch quests because, spoiler warning, Oriath is no more. Oriath got destroyed by Cyrus before Cyrus was killed. So when you do, you will then meet the Kirak and the militia that he is organising in order to safeguard the Atlas of Worlds, and you will be informed that two Eldritch Horrors, the Searing Exarch and the Eater of Worlds, are approaching with the intention of feasting upon the entirety of our existence. So these are going to be the two top bosses of the new expansion, and we will see their influence early on, but actually fighting them will be something that is right at the top end of endgame play. So by completing maps that are influenced by these bosses, the Searing Exarch and the Eater of Worlds, you will then firstly be able to encounter their lieutenants. Their lieutenants are the Black Star and the Infinite Hunger, and once you fought those, you'll then eventually unlock the fights against the Searing Exarch and the Eater of Worlds themselves. Defeating these will grant a number of specific rewards that we'll get to a bit later. Now, those were actually detailed a bit more in the other video that I did today on the actual initial announcement. So there's going to be a whole bunch of things related to new currency orbs that'll be available from killing those bosses. A lot of that information will become a bit clearer as we actually get to play with this content. So at the moment we have a sense of what's coming, but we haven't actually had a chance to experience it. Once we're able to experience it, I think that'll give us a much better chance to really work out exactly what is available in there and what the best uses for things are. Next, we have the Atlas of Worlds, which is being revised considerably. It is no longer going to be a region-based atlas. Instead, the atlas is just one region, and the regional atlas passive trees have been replaced with one passive tree that applies to the entirety of the atlas. Every time you complete an Atlas objective in a mission, which is sometimes beating a map in magic form, sometimes rare, sometimes corrupt rare, you will get +1 Atlas passive tree point. So you can that caps out at, I think, at 117, and that will be a starting point for your progression through the new content that's been added. That will then let you specialize in parts of endgame that you prefer. So if you want to specialize into essences, you'll be able to do that. If you want to specialize into beast crafting, you'll be able to specialize into Ironheart missions. There'll be limits on how much specialization you can manage, and you won't be able to take the whole tree or anything like it. So there will be some choices to be made, but ultimately we have a fair bit of information as to what the tree will look like. In fact, there is a labeled version of the tree. I will put a link to this somewhere, but this is something that's been circulated around Discord a little bit. This is the Atlas passive tree with a bunch of people's predictions of what the nodes are. This is not guaranteed to be correct. So some of these could be wrong. This is just what people have worked out based upon, oh yeah, this is what this looks like. I am assuming that this is very similar to to something with the exact same icon that existed in a previous league. So some of the numbers on this could be very wrong, but I will put a link to this in the description below. And you can have a look and see if there's anything of interest to you in there. We will get the actual Atlas tree, so this is the projection for what it might look like. We'll get the actual thing a bit later on, some point in the next week. Watchstones have been removed as a system and replaced with Voidstones. Now, very important to say that Voidstones come far later in progression than Watchstones did. So if you think back to the way that the Watchstone system worked, the way that you got your Watchstones in a region, let's just consider Glenak Cans for starters. Firstly, you would need to destroy a 0 Watchstone Conqueror in that region. Then a 1 Watchstone Conqueror, then a 2 Watchstone, then a 3 Watchstone Conqueror, and then at that point you'd have all 4 of the Glenak Cans Watchstones acquired. So that's been completely transformed, And now what's going to happen is that you will get no Watchstones for a very long time. The first Watchstone you get will probably be when you kill Uber Elder or the Maven, whichever one of those two bosses you come to first. And that's going to be quite late in your progression. But what will happen is you'll have access to tiers 1 through 16 maps until that point. But you won't have access to all that many maps at each tier. When you do Socket of Voidstone in, you will lose access to some of the lower tiers, and you will gain access to higher tier versions of those maps. So let's just say, for argument's sake, that Beach is a tier 2 map by default. When you put in one Voidstone into your Atlas, it might become tier 7. When you put a second one in, it might become tier 11. A third one might make it tier 14. And then when you put in 4 Voidstones, all maps on the Atlas are tier 16. So you'll be unlocking these Voidstones, and they will allow you more flexibility in what content you run, but they will not give you access to new content. You'll have access to all of the maps from the start, from a 0 Voidstone perspective. The one thing that is gated behind Voidstones, and I do think this is going to be a problem, I'm going to raise this now, is that Sextant modifiers are not available until you have acquired at least 1 Voidstone. And Sextants, therefore, are going to come online much, 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 much later in progression than they have in the past. So you will not be able to use Sextants until you have defeated at least one of these 4 top bosses, and you will not be able to use 4 Sextants on a map until you have defeated all 4 of them. And so that is going to severely delay your ability to use Sextants. Where in the current game, people gain access to low tier Sextants from approximately maybe map tier 5 or 6, medium tier Sextants around map tier 10, and maximum tier Sextants, Awakened Sextants at around map tier 14. I think you'll find instead that it will be quite some time after you complete your 50th tier 14 map that you will finally get access to the Sextant system at all. And it'll probably be 300 or 400 tier 14 maps until you get full access to it. So Sextants are now a very late endgame system, whereas they're moving from being a middle endgame system to a very late endgame system. So that's a big change. I kind of feel like one of these should be moved earlier in progression. I don't think it's a problem to have most of the power here gated behind some of these bosses, but I do think maybe instead of Uber Elder, it should just be whichever encounter you beat first, Shaper or Elder or Uber Elder. But anyways, we'll see what happens. And I'm willing to play with the system and, just reserve judgment until we play with the system. It may just be that you amass a whole bunch of Sextants that you can then use aggressively once you do get one of these bosses down. So the Archnemesis Challenge League is coming out at the same time. Archnemesis we don't know a huge amount about yet. We have the basic premise down pat, and that is that that there will be at least 4 altars in each map, which will contain a crystallized rare monster. You can then use various little league-specific tokens to empower those monsters and release them. And if you empower one, it empowers all of the other ones in the instance. You can fight up to 4 of these in each instance, and when you fight certain combinations of mods on them, you will receive new upgraded tokens. So I really think that we want to play around with this and see how it plays in practice. For the moment, it looks reasonably interesting, but it looks probably more like Essence than anything else that we've got in the game at the moment, where you will encounter just super juiced up rare monsters that you can choose not to engage with if they look too dangerous. And then you can sort of fight them, get some specific rewards. I do think that it'll probably have stronger rewards than Essence does, but we'll mess around with it, find out what it's like in practice. Major new content and features gives a bit of an overview. This is always in the patch notes, gives a sense as to what the new things that are being added in are. Firstly, there's a bunch of new div cards and unique items. Then there are the Eldritch Ichors and the Eldritch Embers. These are new items that... This is a new level of customization of items that is not compatible with Influence. It is only available in body armor, boots, gloves, and helmet. And so it's not something that you can get in jewelry or on weapons, or shields for that matter. But what this will do is it will add an implicit modifier. It's not too different to synthesis mods in this sense, except you have a little bit of a different system of how they're applied. So the process of applying these is that you can get 4 different tiers that can drop, and then there are 2 exceptional tiers that you can only get by upgrading an item. So your tiers that can drop, I'm going to turn them tiers 6, 5, 5, 4, and 3, with tiers 2 and 1 being special items that you can only acquire via other means by crafting them. You will acquire tier 6, 5, 4, and 3 tokens whilst you're doing content. Tier 6 will drop from early maps, tier 5 will be a bit later in maps, and then tiers 4 and 3 will drop quite a bit later. You can then get the Orb of Conflict. If you have one mod from each pool, so let's say that you have a tier 6 item that's from the Eater of a tier 6 mod on your item that's from an Eater of Worlds, and a tier 4 mod that's from the Searing Exarch, you can apply an Orb of Conflict to that, and that will have a chance to increase one mod at the expense of the power of the other. So if you've got a combination of a tier 3 and a tier 4, that might have the tier 3 be upgraded to tier 2 at the expense of the tier 4 being downgraded to tier 5, or it might go the other way around. The tier 3 gets downgraded, the tier 4 gets upgraded, in which case they would become tiers. Tier 3 mod would become tier 4, and the tier 4 mod would become tier 3. So that's some of the things that can be made in terms of adding these mods onto an item. These replace the existing implicits on an item, and they also lock the item so that it cannot have any other influences and it cannot gain those influences. However, they can be pretty powerful. You can get a huge chunk of flat fire damage to spells, for instance. You can get mods that prevent enemies near to your character from recovering life. All sorts of other things. We don't really have a big list yet. Hopefully there will be a big list of all the mods that are available by very early in the league. Ideally it'll get data mined, but in practice it probably won't be. GGG will probably prevent it from being data mined. And that will be something that will mean that it'll take a bit longer to work out what to do with these orbs. But basically, the sense that I get is that the lesser, greater, and grand can probably be used pretty frivolously while you're progressing through the Atlas content. And then the exceptional ones will be something that you will only use at endgame. And then the exceptional plus Orb of Conflict to further modify them beyond that and beyond normal limits, that'll be something that will be an extreme endgame option. Then there's the Eldritch Chaos Orb, Eldritch Exalted, and Eldritch Annulment Orb, which are really interesting in that they care about which of these 2 influences is higher. So if you've got an Eater of Worlds mod and a Searing Exarch mod, and one of them is higher tier than the other, then that item is said to be dominated by that particular outsider. And these will function differently. So the Eldritch Chaos Orb, if the Searing Exarch is dominant, then it will reforge the prefix mods on the item, leaving the suffix alone. If it's the Eater of Worlds that is dominant, then it will re-roll the suffix modifiers and leave the prefixes alone. So this gives you a lot of control over certain item slots, and these will be really powerful crafting orbs. The Exalted Orb, the Eldritch Exalted Orb, adds a mod, and whether it's a prefix or a suffix is determined by dominance, and the Eldritch Orb of Annulment removes a mod. And again, depends upon whether it's a prefix or a suffix. It's dependent upon what's dominant. There's a number of other things that are covered here in terms of new items as well. The important ones, there's a Surveyor's Compass, which is a way to store a Sextant modifier, and there is a Scouting Report, which is an itemized Zana mission. So Zana is being replaced, of course, by Kirak. There's also 3 new gems. These are all support gems, and they're all pretty low impact ones, so they don't feel like new skills entirely. There's Mark on Hit, which does what it says it does, but unlike Hex Touch support, which used to be called Curse on Hit, it does not need to be linked to the attack in question, but it can only trigger a mark on an attack, not on a spell hit. Divine Blessing and Eternal Blessing are new variants of the Blessing skill that used to only exist on the March of the Legion unique boots, and these are something that convert auras into blessings, which don't reserve mana but have other effects to them. There's a number of little minor changes here that have been outlined. So Blight Encounters, you can get multiples of them in an area. Duelist has gotten a new audio dialogue. Really simple quality of life thing here, but an important one. Flasks refill on entering or leaving the Azurite Mine encampment. And there's a number of other little changes there. So the Atlas is being overhauled, but one of the simple things that's happening that's important, it has a lot of impact on the game, is that a number of the Atlas maps are being sort of removed from the Atlas for a period. So these maps will be not able to drop during 3.17, and they are Bazaar, Beach. Oh, sorry, these are being added back. These are ones that were removed in 3.16, and they're coming back. Bazaar, which is okay, Beach, which is great, Belfry, which is okay, Bramble Valley, which is bad, Burial Chambers, which is good, Cage, which is mediocre, Channel, which is mediocre, but on the better end of mediocre, City Square, which is good, Cold River, which is mediocre, Coral Ruins, which is awful, Coves, which is good, Desert Spring, which is okay, Frozen Caverns is okay, Graveyard, Iceberg, Infested Valley, Ivory Temple, Jungle Valley, all okay, Lava Chamber is terrible, Marshes is terrible, Mesa and Peninsula are good, Phantasmagoria is okay, Precinct is okay, Primordial Pool, Shipyard, Shrine, and Volcano, all mediocre maps at the end. So in this lot, there's a few maps that you're going to be pretty happy to see back. I think a lot of people will be glad to see Beach coming back, and there's certainly a number of farming strategies that revolve around Burial Chambers. So there are a few things that will be added that will be impactful there. There's also a bunch of things that are taking a bit of a holiday from the Atlas. Alleyways will be something that will be missed, I think, by a lot of people. It's one of those quiet achiever maps. It has a bunch of divination cards in it, and it's also just a really simple layout. Very somewhat predictable. Barrows is taking a holiday. No one will likely miss that. Bog will be missed a little bit more. Chateau, I like. A lot of people don't. And we'll come back to that one a little bit later when we get to divination cards. Core, Desert, Foundry. Now, Foundry and Fungal Hollow are fairly bad tile sets, but they just look spectacular, so I'll be sad to see them go for that reason. Although they'll be back in 3 months. Lava Lake, Leyline, Lighthouse, Mud Geyser, Park, Pit, Plateau, Primordial Blocks, Racecourse, Reef, Relic Chambers, Sepulchre, Siege, Spider Lair, Sulphur Vents, Sunken City, Terrace, Tropical Island, Waterways, and Wharf. So the big news here, Tropical Island is going away, Park is going away, and Primordial Blocks, interestingly. Primordial Blocks has a hideout in it that a lot of people still want, the Primordial Hideout. That's not going to be available for the entire next 3 months. You can still get it in Standard if you own Primordial Blocks maps there, but there will be no Primordial Blocks maps dropping in this league. So those are the ones that I feel are the more impactful end, and Lighthouse and Alleyways will certainly be missed by some people. Now, Vaal Temple is getting transformed a little bit. There's a bit more on Vaal Temple later, but basically Vaal Temple is getting juiced quite a bit. It now comes from corrupting tier 16 maps, no longer from corrupting tier 15 maps. It's getting buffed, and it will be something that will be a little bit more juicy to run. Something that GGG are doing, because if they didn't do this change with the introduction of the synthesized map base type, maps like the Twisted Distant Memory and the like, one of them is based upon Relic Chambers, one of them is based upon Park. Now, if both Park and Relic Chambers taking a holiday from the Atlas, GG don't want a situation where you can accidentally get a Park map by corrupting, I think that one is the rewritten Distant Memory, that's the Park. They don't want a situation where you can Vaal a map and get an otherwise unavailable map. And so that's the reason that they are adding this new synthesized map base type. And so all of the synthesis maps now use that. One thing that's of interest, they say all 5 unique synthesis maps. There's kind of 6. There's Replica Cortex as well. So I think this wording answers the question of whether Replica Cortex can come from the Divination card that grants a unique synthesis map. It seems that they don't consider it to be one, but I'm assuming that Replica Cortex will have to end up being a synthesized map as well. We'll see what happens there. So some of the map bosses you're required to defeat to upgrade your Pantheon have changed. That's to be expected. A number of bench crafts have been moved, and the favoured map system is being overhauled a lot. So the favoured map system used to be a system where you could pick 3 maps in each region, and you could pick the same map multiple times, and it would cause a strong bias towards that map dropping. You can still do that, but instead it'll be 12 maps across the entire Atlas, and these will be unlocked upon defeating specific bosses. And also completing certain content. So one of them, I think, is completing your first tier 16 map. These will be sort of somewhat all over the place in terms of how you'll unlock them, and we don't have a full list of what the actual requirements are yet. but I do think that hopefully we will get access to this system a little bit earlier. It's come online far too late in all of the time that it's existed. So it was introduced in 3.10. I think not immediately at the start of 3.10, but it came about. We've had it for almost 2 years now, and it's always come online too late because you've had to complete every map in a region of the Atlas in order to get access to it. Hopefully you can get started on it a little bit earlier, just so that you can use it to complete things on your Atlas and find maps that you can't otherwise get to drop. That would make things a lot better there. Conqueror and Awakener encounters can still be accessed. If you're lucky, Kirak may offer a Conqueror's map. This will probably be one small source of Conqueror maps, but I believe the main source of Conqueror's maps will probably be map completions. And if we have a look at the Atlas layout, the Atlas passive tree, it seems like it's speculated that there's some Cirrus-related nodes here. And chances are that will have things that are tied to the Conquerors of the Atlas on it. And again, it's not really known for certain, but that's widely speculated as being where those will come from. Kirak can now also offer missions. This again replaces Jazana missions involving expedition, ritual, heist, and ambush mechanics. So ambush sort of already existed in that you had sometimes you would get a mission where the goal was to open a specific unique strongbox, but it looks like there'll be more strongbox related ones. The thing I'm actually surprisingly interested in here is the heist ones. I've got a feeling that getting a smuggler's cache from this will feel pretty impactful, given that I'm assuming that's the thing that Kirak will send you in to do. You might even get something that says find the blueprint in this mission, and obviously blueprints are always a big drop when you get them. Rituals should also be pretty impactful too. So there's a lot of stuff here, and especially if Kirak can offer things related to expedition logbooks would be even better. Like if he gave you a mission that said, go into this map and find the expedition logbook, that would be fantastic. There are new mods that can roll on maps, expedition logbooks, heist contracts, blueprints, and delve areas. This is probably going to be one of the highest impact mods lines in the entire patch notes, and it's something a lot of people have just sort of flipped past when they've been reading. Map mods are basically what kills you if you die in a map. It's almost always because of map mods, and having more of them is going to really change the meta up a lot. In 3.16, they added a couple of new map mods, some of which were pretty punishing for certain builds. Like, for instance, there was one that said to Elementalists, you're going to hate me, but you can't use you can't apply exposure to enemies. And that means that one of the major Elementalist nodes, like one of the draws into being an Elementalist ascendancy, is the node that empowers your exposure. And so that was a really brutal mod. So it's hard to know what they'll be. One that I think should exist and doesn't currently is critical strike. Players are, say, 40, 50, 60% less likely to, or have 40, 50 or 60% less critical strike chance. That doesn't exist at the moment, but stuff like that would be interesting, I think. New modifiers that can be obtained from Sextants. And now, one thing to note is that Nemesis 3 is going away. That was announced during the actual spoiler stream. Maps, heist contracts, and blueprints can no longer roll players have point blank. This is actually a nerf overall, because that's usually something that's just a completely harmless mod for most builds. Obviously, for some builds, it's kind of frustrating, but broadly speaking, it was a nothing mod, like Elemental Equilibrium was a nothing mod when that was on maps, heist contracts, and blueprints, and so that's gone away now. Now, something really interesting, there's a major overhaul to the drop pool of the Maven. So here we see the Maven Orb is now called the Orb of Dominance and no longer drops from the Maven. Additionally, the Orb of Unmaking no longer drops from Maven. Don't worry about the Maven's drops. The Maven's drops are looking really good in this league. So the Orb of Dominance appears that it may drop from multiple endgame bosses. This hasn't been confirmed and it's not in the patch notes, but it's something that people have reported was being said just from chat that's been taking place on various streams. It looks like it's going to probably be the new source for the Maven Orb is going to be from things like Uber Elder. And who knows, maybe it will drop from the Maven as well, maybe it won't. but it seems like it will be mostly from other endgame bosses. The Hook Divination card is currently turned off. That's the one for a unique Watchstone because there's no unique Watchstones anymore. Presumably this will come back as a unique Voidstone when GGG eventually does add unique Voidstones, which don't currently exist. Added a new Harvest Craft that allows you to change a Conqueror Fragment into another random Conqueror Fragment of that type. So this is just a reminder that, say, Baran maps, with Baran, at the moment in the 3.16 era of the game, you don't get an itemized Cirrus encounter. You have to set up your Atlas in a certain way, then you can fight Cirrus, but you can't trade that access to the Cirrus encounter to another player. In 3.17, you'll be able to, and so this allows you to swap the fragments around. Essentially, the way that the Shaper and Elder Guardians work at the moment, the Conquerors will work that way in the future, with Cirrus being their capstone. Added a new harvesting craft that allows you to sacrifice a high tier map to generate a random Conqueror occupied map. And also something I think a lot of people weren't expecting, and that this is probably going to cause a bunch of anxiety amongst standard players. Scourged maps will no longer have any Scourge-related mechanics, and those won't function. So Scourge maps are not going Legacy, they are just simply going to lose their Scourging, it seems. So, next up we have rewards from Conquerors. The Awakened Gems are being moved to drop from the Maven's Crucible, and as well as that from the Absence of Mercy and Empathy. So the Maven Encounter will drop every Awakened Gem, and Maven's Crucible fights will drop some of them. So that's an interesting change that's happening, and is something that is going to, I think, feel pretty impactful for progression. And it means, well, it's not really going to mean much for a lot of players because Cyrus is still going to be fine to fight. Cyrus is still going to have a good loot pool, and also this is going to give the Maven a lot more loot drops. One of the big things that they're talking about here, though, is that with Conquerors being moved to secondary late game content stage, influenced items will be harder to obtain, and certain generic modifiers from influenced items are significant improvements to damage for a large subset of builds, and locking that behind influenced mechanic limits player options and pushes players to chase the secondary content more. So what they're doing is they are removing some mods from the Conqueror mod pool and putting them into the traditional mod pool. Most importantly here, influenced amulet prefixes that grant +1 to the level of gems are being moved to the core amulet mod pool. They are no longer tied to influence. I believe there's a typo in this line. They say here, influenced amulet prefix modifiers that grant +1 to the level of gems have been added to the core amulet modifier pool and can no longer roll on influenced amulets. What I think they mean with that is not that influenced amulets are prohibited from rolling these mods, but instead that they are no longer treated as an influenced mod. The same thing is happening with shield modifiers that grant maximum resistance modifiers. These are being moved to the core shield pool rather than being on influence shields and delve shields. Number of other changes that are happening as well, but they're much less important than the first two. The Maven's uniques are pretty much all getting buffed, and the buffs are big too. Doppelganger Guise is the rarest item from the Maven. And this is the chess piece that provides a choice between two modes. In one mode, you destroy corpses on hitting them and you have a huge boost to your critical strike chance. In the other mode, you take less physical and chaos damage taken. That physical and chaos damage mitigation is changing from 15 to 25% up to 30 to 40% less. That is going to be a huge deal, and I think Doppelganger Guys will join the Brass Dome as the two best defensive armors that are not Stasis Prison. So you'll have Stasis Prison will be the top tier defensive armor if you want a pure defensive armor. Stasis Prison will be the God tier 1. Then you'll have Brass Dome and Doppelganger Guys, and then you'll have stuff like Calm's Heart miles below that, or Life Resist, Chest Piece, Six Links, and things like that will be miles below that. Next, you have Arn's Anguish, Alicia's Delight, and Graven's Secret. These are getting an extra charge of their relevant type. This is a pretty big deal because these are the belts that modify the way charges work, and they have pretty big effects on what they do with charges. So this should be significant as well. This is not some small change, and this will add several percent to the damage. So for instance, this is an additional 6% chance to deal triple damage with one of them. Legacy of Fury is the boots from the Maven. These are the ones that drop Scorched Ground. That's being changed to nearby enemies are scorched, which should be easier to apply. And nearby enemies, you suffer less resistance penalties. This looks like it'll be much stronger. Legacy of Fury looks like it will be far better than it has been in the past. And I think that this will actually see some serious use now. It's not going to be a universally good item, but it will be something that is used in some situations. So next up, there's changes to Atlas-based types. This is things like Crystal Belt that drop only in one region of the Atlas. These are no longer going to be tied to a particular location on the Atlas. Instead, they're just going to be added to the normal drop pool, but they'll be made rarer. And so that's going to be the plans for things like Crystal Belt, Vanguard Belt, all those good things, Opal Rings and the like. Sextants are something that are being changed here. Now, there's a bit of discussion here where they say Sextants were previously applied to Watchstones, which you could acquire very early in your Atlas progression. They'll now be applied to Voidstones, which is something you'll encounter for the first time very deep into progression. So I've already discussed this a bit, but you will only see Awakened and Elevated Sextants now, and they will be much later on in progression. You will also be able to bank your Sextant mods. If you get a Sextant mod that's good but that you don't have a use for now, you can itemize it. You can put it into one of the new currency items, the Surveyor's Compass, and you can then put that aside as a Sextant that you can use later, or you can even trade to other players. I think there'll be a huge economy in trading pre-rolled Sextants as a result of this, because they will be really strong. These Surveyor's Compasses. And Sextants especially, there's a large number of Sextants that do something that's universally strong. So this is something like +6 packs of Chaos Monsters. Those ones won't be traded very much. The ones that will be traded are the things that do something that is strong, but that is not universal, such as +2 Abysses, or areas contain a Mirror of Delirium, or areas contain Ritual Altars. These are super strong effects that are going to be extremely sought after, but not by everyone. They're going to be sought after by people who are using a specific farming strategy. And I think you'll find that almost all of those that roll will get put into Surveyor's Compasses in Trade League and then traded with other players, and there'll be a large market for these. The next thing that's coming up is the Vaal Temple map, and GG outlined that they think that corrupting into a Vaal Temple was pretty much ruining your map, which was an interesting little bit of history with this. Vaal Temple in 3.5, so this is the Betrayal expansion. I made a lot of currency making Vaal Temples in that map, in that league. What happened was in 3.5, the way that the Atlas worked back then, only maps, whenever you applied a Vaal Orb to a map, it had a 1 in 8 chance of +1 tiering that map. When it did +1 tier the map, it would pick a map at random from the maps that were available in that quadrant of the Atlas. So it'd be, if it was in the southeast quadrant of the Atlas, it would stay in the southeast. It would pick one at random from the pool of maps that were 1 tier higher. And what this ended up meaning was that if you corrupted a tower, you would have 2 outcomes that were possible if it went +1, so to tier 16. One was that it would become a Guardian map. I think from memory, Guardian of the Minotaur. And the other outcome was that it would become a Vaal Temple. Now, what I would do was I would buy tier 15 towers from other players. I'd buy heaps and heaps and heaps of them. I would roll them up, ready to run them myself, but not corrupted. Then I would go and corrupt them all. If they went unidentified, I would run them because I knew that they had mods I could beat. On the flip side, if they went to Vaal Temple, I would sell them. And there were just so few Vaal Temples on the market that every single one that I sold was selling for almost an Exalted Orb. And I could also sometimes get a Maze the Minotaur, which back then, because of the different economy with maps, was also worth quite a bit. At other times, I just end up getting an 8-mod tower map. And when I got an 8-mod tower map, I would just turn around and sell that as well. So this was my little currency making strategy. And it got ruined by a 3.5.1 patch. And what that, I think it was 3.5.1, might have been 3.5.2. But what that did was it changed the fact that only tier 15s from the southeast area of the Atlas could turn into a Vaal Temple. They made it so that it didn't matter which quadrant of the Atlas you were in. Any tier 15 had the potential to become a Vaal Temple. And this ended up making Vaal Temples super common. super, super, super common because people tended to Vaal a lot of their tier 15 maps. And so across the whole league, about 1 in 10 of them started becoming Vaal Temples. This would then persist for a couple of years. And so Vaal Temple now is generally a 5 chaos map, except, right at the start of the league. And so people felt that when they were turning their tier 15 into a Vaal Temple, they were pretty much ruining their tier 15. It would be worth less than it was before they corrupted it. GGG's approach here is to juice Vaal Temple to a crazy level, crazy level by adding a new special implicit modifier to it. And this is going to give the maps, the area contains 10 additional guarded Vaal vessels as an implicit modifier. So what this is going to do is cause it to generate with 10 additional Vaal vessels. Each will act as a strongbox, which will spawn 3 packs of monsters as well as a Vaal side area boss. So this will basically make the map incredibly monster packed. They'll also have additional drops that are themed around corruption. This will only be present on Vaal Temple maps found after 3.17's release, and I'm really looking forward to seeing this in practice. Who knows, maybe I've been bullying the streamer Slippery Jim 8 to try and get him to do, he does a lot of layout and loot videos. I've been trying to get him to do 200 Vaal Temples just because I'm a terrible person and I like to see good people like him suffer. And so I've been sort of joking with him that he needs to do that. Well, maybe he'll do it this league because they're going to be so much juicier than they have been in the past. And if he doesn't, who knows, maybe I will. Next changes to Blight Ravage maps, and these are having their scaling with quantity on the map doubled. This is not as big a deal as it looks, although it is somewhat significant. But I do think that the Blight Ravage maps are going to see nerfs to some of the most broken strategies for beating them. There are a couple of ways of trivializing Blight Ravage maps by permanently stunning enemies. I'm pretty certain that those will be dealt with via undocumented nerfs. The next section is a fairly big one, and this is divination cards in the Atlas rotation. So as maps are removed from the Atlas, some divination cards may no longer be able to drop. GG have done careful looking over to see exactly what has been rendered impossible to acquire via this change, and they've done some work on that and made sure that everything has a drop location. Some of these are just basically being removed from one map and added to another, but others are getting new locations entirely. So one of the things that's really significant is that we were never able to work out for certain where the fateful meeting divination card dropped from. It was the divination card, I think it was added in 3.13, that dropped. It turned out it was from Atlas. It was from invasion bosses, but only when you had the exotic goods Atlas passive skill allocated, and it was extremely rare when you did. What this did was that it's a set of 9 from memory for a 2 implicit corrupted double influenced unique league exclusive unique item with a very high item level. This will now drop from Vaal Flesh Merchants. Another thing that's significant is that there's a couple of changes where divination cards have been added to more maps by these changes. Some cases are like that, the divination cards will be made slightly rarer. There's no clarification as to exact numbers on this, but it looks like it's only where there's been a great increase in the number of areas that they're available in. Additionally, a long-standing bug in the code determining area level restrictions for some div card drops has been fixed. This means that cards intended to have a high area level requirement, which is mostly ones that grant item level 100 items, will no longer fluctuate wildly in availability from league to league. So I wasn't aware of this bug, but presumably this means that divination cards like the Opulent will come online a little bit later. And also this might be significant for some of the divination cards like Draped in Dream or the White Knight that are a bit rarer and that drop influenced item level 100 gear. You might start seeing those a little bit more regularly. Like it's not that they're going to be made more common by this change. It's that you won't have leagues where they're almost unavailable. There's a bunch of information on individual cards. Probably most significant here is that the Wretched is losing several of its drop locations, including the Tower and the Vaal Temple map. So those are a couple of things that will reduce the incentive to run towers back to back. You will only have one chance at a Headhunter div card. You will not be able to get a Mage Blood div card, the best Mage Blood div card in the game as well, or at least the best one that we know of yet. Not that the Wretched is particularly good at dropping Mage Bloods, it's just that it is still better than anything else. Next up is one that actually affects one of my divination cards. So a small number of div cards turn in for specific maps. This means that either those maps have to always be present when an Atlas rotation occurs, or the rewards of those cards have to be altered so that they can always give a valid reward. And so these were changed, they're being changed initially to give a specific tier of map. And I also say that people that have commissioned these cards will be contacted to redesign their reward if they wish, or they can email design@grindinggear to discuss changing the reward. I've actually already sent in an email about mine. I submitted the price of protection in an earlier era of the game, back when high tier maps were genuinely treasure, whereas nowadays they're just a sort of minor consumable that you use. And I thought that the best way to reflect the price of protection's original theme and still stay true to the artwork and the like was to change it to give a corrupt rare guardian map. And so that's what I've suggested to them. And GGG will make up their mind as to whether that's appropriate or not. I think that would be a simple enough change that would just solve all of the future problems that I may have with this card, because it certainly has caused them a few problems now. I think there was one of the Mayhem events they had to nerf the card for, because otherwise by the time that you got to endgame, because you'd sometimes get 20 invasion bosses in a zone, if they hadn't done the nerf, by the time you got to endgame, you would have probably had 50 to 100 copies of this card, because it got quite a high drop rate from invasion bosses. So that was the first thing they had to deal with it. Then after that, they had problems with the change to the Watchstone system. It went from giving an Elder Chateau map to a 4 Watchstone Chateau map. Now it's being, sort of changed again. So anyways, that's my suggestion. Something that will probably not need to be changed again will be if they just change it to be a Guardian occupied map and then just made it corrupt rare. Prophecy, everything we sort of already knew about Prophecy is in here. So Prophecy is being basically removed entirely. And the things that are new here is that most existing Prophecy rewards that are sort of baked into content are being changed to currency rewards. So if you have a Portentous Delirium Orb, it's going to become a Fine Delirium Orb. If you have a Prophecy reward type on a Heist Blueprint, that's going to be changed to currency. Perception Heist contracts and blueprints now spawn generic reward chests in place of the Prophecy rewards that they used to have. This is mostly a buff. The Prophecy rewards were pretty bad in Heist, and whilst the generic rewards are not great, they are broadly speaking better than what we had. Additionally, Lily Roth will invite herself to your hideout once you complete her quest in Act 6, and you will have access to her gem shop, you'll be able to sell items to her, and you can turn divination cards into her. So she's basically Navali, but better, except without the whole Prophecy thing. There's also some information on what's going to happen to some of the divination cards that are related to Prophecies, and some of these are better, some of them are worse. Note in the Wind is better, it's going to give you an Asenath's Chant. Akil's Prophecy is going to be better, it's just going to give you the Fated Unique item, no silly quest to go with it. Beauty Through Death is going to just give you an Atziri's Reflection, which actually is worse than it used to be, because you can no longer use it on a influenced item. Mad King now just grants you Calm's Way. Vile Power now just grants you Doomfletcher's Prism. Now, Immortal Resolve is only going to grant a 6-linked influenced body armor, which is worse than it used to be. Jeweler's Boon, however, grants a 5-linked influenced body armor, and that's probably better than it used to be. So it's an interesting dynamic where one of these is worse, one of them is better than it used to be. One thing I'm interested to see, what happens if you turn in the Jeweler's Boon on a character that is less than level 68? Can you get anything at all? Because you normally can't. We'll see what happens with that. A number of divination cards have just been put on, put on hold for the moment. Valley of Steel Boxes, Iron Bard, Side Quest, Sambodi's Wisdom, and Friendship. And the big deal for power gamers out of this entire change series is that Trash to Treasure is gone. And that's going to mean that Chance Orbs are going to be the only way to get influenced versions of uniques now. Scour chancing, which takes a long time. It's not the only one, but it's going to be the only way that you can target something. There's a couple of little changes to Betrayal here that are significant. These are a buff to players that are farming Betrayal, and they're designed to make it so that if you've got a leader of a safe house leader that you want to get rid of, or that you want to rank up, it should be easier to get them into an encounter. So what you'll need to do is just put a bunch of leveled up characters into your into that region, and then the leader will start joining them on jobs more often. There's a couple of fixes to bugs in Delve that allowed a small percentage of players, very tiny percentage of players, to do some really broken stuff there. Those sort of unintended abuse cases are being nerfed pretty hard, and that should fix a few ridiculous things that were being done in Delve. There's a number of changes to Act 2 monsters, but they're not massive changes. They're much smaller than the ones that were made in 3.15 to Act 1 monsters, and there's a few new monsters being added in there. Spriggans, Wasps, Undead Vaal, Scuttlers, and Salvagers. Tormented Martyrs are being nerfed, and hardcore players are undoubtedly rejoicing about this. These are one of the Torment Ghosts. All the other Torment Ghosts are pretty harmless. Then you got a Tormented Martyr, and it can just surprise kill you. Well, that's being changed. They are no longer going to have their crazy form of scaling that they've had in the past. They'll have a much more consistent amount of damage that they do, which means that they should be much more easily manageable. There's a number of small changes to monster modifiers. Initially, when I read this, I thought it might have been a buff to Headhunter. Now, the more that I think about it, the more I think it's probably not really, unless you wanted Chaos Resistance. So it means that a Headhunter will be able to give you Chaos Resistance sometimes, but mostly I think this is just going to dilute the mod pool for Headhunter characters rather than actually make things more powerful. Tolman and the Mausoleum map boss, their Detonate Dead is being changed slightly and is just basically being nerfed a bit. Next up, we have the huge section on hit-based spellcasting. Now, this is something that we discussed in the Day 9 video, link in the description below, about the Balanced Manifesto. So I'm not going to go through that again, except just to give a very quick high-level overview, which is that at high gem levels, manually cast spells should deal about 45% more initial damage. So the amount of initial damage that's dealt by a spell at gem level 20 will be pretty much in line with what it used to be at gem level 23 for most gems, with some gems getting a little bit more or a little bit less than that depending on their power in the current state of the game. Then there are nerfs to most sources of triggering of spells, and the goal here is to keep the power of a triggered spell at approximately the same level as it is in 3.16, whilst improving the power of manually casting spells. That's their goal. Don't know how accurate it'll be. I think that there'll be some things that are made worse. Using spell traps feels like it will be worse. And using, so that when I say spell traps, I mean trap support linked to a spell. That feels like it'll be worse. Using mines maybe a little bit worse, but otherwise I think most things should be about the same power that they used to be. There's a number of additional gems that have got numbers changes that weren't previously mentioned in the like in the previous video that I did, because there's just simply more information on these, on the sorts of numbers that are being done. So there's a whole bunch of information here. Also of interest, Ice Storm is being buffed. Probably not by enough to make it usable though. Some gems that I thought might have been buffed and haven't been. Soul Rend I thought might have been buffed. It still deals the same amount of damage over time. Actually, it's getting a 0.2% nerf for some reason. But the initial hit damage that it does, which no one ever bothers scaling, is slightly higher. So Soul Rend is not getting buffed, and that was one that I thought might have been in line for a buff. Importantly, something I think a lot of people are interested in playing, Vortex is not really being changed in any meaningful way. So that's all of the changes there. I won't go into any more detail because there's a whole video on them that was quite long. Lightning Trap still looks good, and I'm still considering using it as a league starter. Bunch of changes to cast speed modifiers. These are all buffs. There's just simply more sources of investment in cast speed, and many of them look like they're quite good. Threshold Jewels nerfs have been discussed extensively, and broadly speaking, I think this is going to ruin one or two skills while having very little impact on most others. So the skills that look like they're going to get ruined by this are Frostbolt may be ruined, and Glacial Hammer may be ruined, and maybe Viper Strike. Everything else looks like it's fine. Orb of Storms is getting changed and looks like it could be pretty good, but I want to play with it before I give any further judgment on it. And really that's about it in terms of that section, other than the massive discussion we had in the day 9 version of this video. Hit-based bow attacks, again, not much more to discuss here. Day 9 covered most of this, except to say that we now have the numbers on how much physical damage on bows is getting increased, and it is a lot. This is a lot. And so hopefully this is something that will make it more viable to play a physical damage bow character, and also to make them more effective earlier in character progression than they have been in the past. These buffs are huge. There's a number of little nerfs to uniques, with the intention being that they stay about the same power level overall. And I'm not sure how, I haven't gone through all of these individually to say how good they'll be. One thing I noticed though, there doesn't seem to be anything on Doomfletch Prism here. And if that's correct, Doomfletch Prism looks like it will be a really, really good item. So a whole bunch of little changes to quivers that also make quivers stronger. Again, nothing new here. Quivers are just going to be much better, but this is stuff we already knew was going to be changed. Sources of added damage, there's just some nerfs to added cold support, added lightning support, added chaos damage support. We already knew about this, discussed on day 9, nothing particularly overwhelming. There are also considerable buffs, and we've got some numbers for it now, to flat fire to spells and similar mods on caster weapons, and also to two-handed weapon flat elemental damage molds. These look quite a bit better than they were in the past, and should be pretty impactful. A lot of the Hydrosphere cheese is getting dealt with. We knew about that earlier. Triggering marks is something that is interesting in that we already knew that this was happening. There's a bunch of changes being made to marks, making them so that they're permanent now. You just cast them once at the start of a boss encounter. They're always there. You can now trigger them via a new support gem that's being added. But the old Shaper influence trigger Assassin's Mark on hit against rare and unique enemies, that is going entirely legacy. So you're not going to be able to get that anymore, but there will be alternatives, especially for attack builds. For caster builds, you might actually want to cast a mark as the first thing you do against a genuinely tough boss. Okay, fortification and damage reduction is something we already knew. This is not the solution to fortification that we were looking for, but it's a step in the right direction. Attack characters and Frenzy Charge Sustain is new. So there is a new Mark Mastery that is really substantial. This is going to be a huge deal for boss encounters, especially on characters that can hit a monster fast. And this is a new Mark Mastery, 10% chance to gain a Frenzy Charge on hit against a marked enemy. As long as you are hitting at least once a second, this will give you a reasonably good uptime on maximum Frenzy Charges. And most people are going to be hitting more than once a second. So, you know, if you're hitting 3 times a second, this will give you something like 95% uptime against bosses for maximum Frenzy Charges. This is a huge improvement over a lot of things that have existed in the past. You are definitely taking this on any character that is Frenzy Charge based, because it's amazingly strong. Now, there's a line that a lot of people have misinterpreted here. And I really want to just unpack what this means, reduced resistances, because it's a complex one. Now, what I think confuses people is most people think of their resistances as already being a percentage. So, you know, you think of your fire resistance as being 75%. What I want you to do is don't think of it as 75% for a second. Just think of it as a score of 75. So it's out of 100, but we're not going to think of it as a percentage. There are modifiers that are like plus 24 fire resistance. This is the normal mod that you would get on a lot of gear. Then there are multipliers. These will be written as something like 15% reduced fire resistance. These do not exist in many places, and they form a multiplier. What this line is about is what happens when you've got multiple of these modifiers together and they exceed negative 100%. In that case, your resistances will be 0, just like if you'd equip Vaal of the Night. The reason that they're doing this is because otherwise, by combining the new staff, I think it's called the Annihilating Light, and also some of the, I think, a Blight League uniques, maybe it's Crown of the Thermophile, or the Timeless Jewel, I think there's a Timeless Jewel that's related. By combining these effects, you could get yourself into a situation where you would have a massively negative amount of resistances, effective resistances. So equipping an item that said plus 40% fire, plus 40 fire resistance would instead have that effect reduced by 160%, and then suddenly that would be negative 24 to your fire resist. And so that's what they're trying to avoid here. This will avoid that. And ultimately, it's just there for a couple of very corner cases. The vast majority of players will never notice this line. It is there for very specific cases. Very importantly, this is not a nerf to Doriani's prototype. Doriani's prototype is as good in 3.17.0 as it was in 3.16.0, except that you can't get Scourge Implicits anymore. Skill balance. Detonate Dead. Detonate Dead was causing problems, so we took it out the back, we shot it, then we dug up the corpse, then we shot it again, then we dug it up and we fed it to the dog. Now, basically what they're doing here, there's a number of changes we already knew to Detonate Dead, but the big deal is that the certain corpses have far higher life totals than others, giving it extreme survivability when used as a Spectre and very high damage of skills based on their corpse life. Corpses that are raised as Spectres will now have a cap of 360% of base life. This is the same as a Kitava's Herald, and whilst this is a high number, it is less than half of some of the highest Spectres. So this is going to considerably decrease some of the damage that Detonate Dead builds were doing. I think that Detonate Dead Ignite will still be a build that can complete all content, but we will not see another player repeat the feat of defeating the entirety of the endgame using nothing other than magic items. That was done using the currently super broken 3.16 version of Detonate Dead. This is going to fix a lot of the balance issues that were causing that. So instead of having 800 to a 1200% maximum life on monsters, they'll be hard capped at 360%. And whilst Detonate Dead will still hit pretty hard at that point, it's not going to be ridiculous. Seismic Trap is being nerfed, but we don't have the full details yet. We're not going to get the full details on this until the 2020 gems are released. So unfortunately, nothing more to say on that. Toxic Rain is getting nerfed, just what we already knew about. It's still going to be a very good build. Next, there's a couple of quality of life changes to Summon Spectral Wolf, and then we have the nerf to March of the Legion. I think most people think March of the Legion as an item is probably dead now. I'm willing to hold out until we see the actual gem itself, also the item itself, but I do think they're probably right. I don't think we're going to see many people using March of the Legion anymore, which honestly is better than it being like such a clunky item to use, feeling like it's absolutely mandatory on builds. Something that's really interesting here though, sort of hidden away amongst everything else, is this changes to Supreme Ego. So this now changes your auras from your skills to only affect you. Aura skills have 1% more effect per 2% of maximum mana that they reserve, and 40% more mana reservation of skills. It no longer has you can only have one permanent aura on you from your skills. This feels like it's pretty strong as a package. I think that Supreme Ego looks like it could be a good setup to have, but every build that was based around Supreme Ego is going to change now. So you're not going to build things the way you used to. You're going to have to build them different ways, but Supreme Ego feels like the numbers on it are pretty good at the moment. Let's just wait and see how they actually turn out in play. Next up, there's a couple of already known about nerfs to Immortal builds. We knew that was happening. Changes to Dancing Dervish, which were in my Day 8 video, and a couple of tiny little things. Void Fletcher is being nerfed. It's not being gutted, but it is being nerfed pretty hard. It's probably going to go from best quiver in the game to just a solid quiver that people will use until they get an extraordinary rare. But I think it'll be quite good without being extraordinary now. And then there's a couple other really tiny changes that will have only impacts in a few very corner cases. There's some improvements to what can roll in the way of added damage modifiers on gloves, which are still not great, but they're sort of okay. They're better than they were before. And then there's an interesting one that we weren't really expecting. There's more opportunities to invest in the Recoup mechanic. And this keeps feeling like GGG keep pushing this. Obviously, there's Stasis Prison at the extreme end of Recoup, but well short of Stasis Prison, these new ring modifiers that exist allow you to build your own Stasis Prison in a way. So you can get 13 to 15% of damage taken recouped as life. Presumably you can scale this up to 18% with Catalysts, and get that on both rings. That's 36%. Take all the recoup nodes on the tree. You're recouping most of the damage you take. This is, we can't have Stasis Prison, but we can have Stasis Prison at home type levels. And you might be able to do some really ridiculous things if you get these mods on Amethyst rings. You may be able to do some crazy things with Forbidden Rite as a skill here. Forbidden Rite also got some numerical increases in this as well, so maybe there is a self-cast, life-based Forbidden Rite build that is just waiting to be discovered as a result of these changes being made. A couple other tiny little changes that are being made where, just homogenizing some spots where there's some weird ways that you can get, weird spots that you can get items are being moved around. These will be sometimes a buff, sometimes a nerf, but most players won't notice them. There is a change that's being made to improve middle tier rolls on spellcaster weapons, just for spell damage prefixes, which are useful. This will be a buff, but it's not anything particularly extraordinary. It means that mediocre rolls will be better than they used to be. You'll be less dependent upon getting a glyphic or runic weapon, although you will still obviously want a glyphic or runic weapon because they are still better. A couple of changes to cluster jewels to deal with some of the most crazy abuse cases for stacking of total life recovery per second from leech. And this was something that was not really intended to happen. And so this is basically doubling down on crushing the solo jug build. The shortcut divination card is being changed to only drop in high level zones and to award a maximum possible move speed flask. So Quicksilver Flask of the Cheetah with an item level of 100. A couple of changes to crafting recipe locations, mostly them being made earlier in the game, access to them earlier in the game. These will be big as a quality of life change for the axe. Kirak League mods, i.e. Zana mods, were already something I did a video on. They're being changed around a bit. Ritual will be better than people give it credit for. And that is the case even though the Cirrus +1 level Watchstones won't be around anymore. Even with that in mind, Ritual will still be a very solid option here. That's because of the incredible amount of Mirrors of Kalandra that come out of Rituals when you use 4 Bloodstained Vessels. When I say incredible, it's not like it's an absolute fountain of mirrors, but probably the majority of Mirrors of Kalandra that exist in this league will be found by a tiny number of players that are using Ritual to its full potential, unless there's major changes to how Ritual works under the hood. And really, that's the majority of it. We've got some tiny UI changes here, 2 of which are important. One of which is that advanced mod descriptions is no longer an option, it's just always on. So no more of this, you have to turn on a menu option in order to be able to hold Alt when you're hovering over an item. That'll be automatically there. And you'll also have the option to visually hide your life and mana reservation, which I think will be welcome. Most people won't use this, but I think it will be welcomed by a few people. Another thing that's really good for advanced mod descriptions as well is it will display the English name of the item as well with unique items and with base item types, if English isn't your first language. So let's say that you're playing in French and you hover over an Eternity Shroud. The name, the Eternity Shroud, will still appear in French, but it will also have the English translation there as well. And so that's really useful if you wanted to search on Google for builds that use this item. You wouldn't need to translate the Eternity Shroud from French into English. You would already have the English translation there. So you could just do a Google search for the Eternity Shroud and find builds, even though you may not be able to follow everything in that build. It's just this is a major quality of life improvement for people whose first language is not English. One of those things is a great change, even though it does nothing for me. Whole bunch of bug fixes here. There doesn't seem to be anything really nasty hidden in here that I've noticed, although it's always possible to miss things. And then there's always a couple of little changes, so let's just do a quick refresh, just on the off chance that there's any further changes that have been made since this was posted, because they do seem to keep getting changed, there do seem to be small things getting added in there. And actually, no, there's not. There's nothing since I was going through here last. Anyways, that is the patch notes. There is a huge amount to discuss there, and I'm sure people will continue discussing things down in the comments below. But otherwise, I'm going to leave it there. May your Vaal Orbs have interesting results. Don't use one on the servers. Don't use one on the patch notes. And I will see you in a few days' time as the information continues to dribble out about 3.17.